Anyway, I did chapters 3 and a little bit of 4 last week, but the recording wasn't fabulous and no one was here, so I figured I'd just do it again. So thank you all for coming. Gonna start the YouTube about now. Hi everyone. Here we are with Capitalist Realism, chapter 3, called Capitalism and the Real. And I think this is a Lacanian term, the real, but we will see. And just a recap. I think everyone knows who's here right now, but in chapter 1 he explains this issue of capitalist realism, where it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And then in chapter 2 he kind of gives his prescription, which is that we need to organize, specifically he thinks around mental health and bureaucracy. So I don't know what this one is going to be about, but let's see, despite having read it last time. RuPaul going, the realness. Yeah, totally. That's exactly what capitalist realism is. No, really, it's fine. Capitalist realism is not an original coinage. It was used as far back as the 1960s by a group of German pop artists and by Michael Schudson in his 1984 book Advertising, The Uneasy Persuasion, both of whom were making parodic references to socialist realism, which I think is like an art style, right? Socialist realism. It's that kind of classic blocky, pseudo-realist illustrations of large proletarian families working the fields and making iron and stuff. I think that's what they mean. What is new about my use of the term is the more expansive, even exorbitant meaning that I ascribe to it. Capitalist realism, as I understand it, cannot be confined to art or the quasi-propagandistic way in which advertising functions. And the homoeroticism, you can't forget that, yeah. It is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. If capitalist realism is so seamless, and if current forms of resistance are so hopeless and impotent, where can an effective challenge come from? It's a good question. A moral critique of capitalism, emphasizing the ways in which it leads to suffering, only reinforces capitalist realism. Poverty, famine, and war can be presented as an inevitable part of reality, while the hope that these forms of suffering could be eliminated, easily painted as naive utopianism. Yeah, it's true. Capitalist realism can only be threatened if it is shown to be in some way inconsistent or untenable. If, that is to say, capitalism's ostensible realism turns out to be nothing of the sort. Needless to say, what counts as realistic, what seems possible at any point in the social field, is defined by a series of political determinations. I feel like there's some very, entry-level positive thinking thing here, everything's impossible until it's achieved, or something like that. But on some level that is true, right? People do think that stuff is impossible, and then it happens, and it turns out it was just a political unavailability of that possibility or something. An ideological position can never really be successful until it's naturalized, and it cannot be naturalized while it's still thought of as a value rather than a fact. Okay, so this makes me think of the issue about it wasn't real communism or something along those lines, right? It's always going to be not real communism until we have a successful one or something like that, and then it'll be oh yeah, communism was possible all along, or something along those lines. Accordingly, neoliberalism has sought to eliminate the very category of value in the ethical sense. Over the past 30 years, capitalist realism has successfully installed a business ontology in which it's simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. As any number of radical theorists from Brecht through to Foucault and Badiou have maintained, emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. Cool. So, this makes me think of Foucault and his archaeological genealogical approach, where he just kind of looks at the history of a phenomenon, and he talks about mental illness and traces it back to leper ships and things like that, and the kind of hospital for the mentally ill kind of developed as an institution out of that. And that's where that famous quote about is it surprising that prisons resemble schools, barracks, factories, and hospitals, all of which resemble prisons. It's because there's like a literal genealogical relationship. Anyway, I think they're just trying to say like, we need to understand the like weird random shit that has accrued and become the modern like social order, that it could have been a different way or something like that. I don't know. It seems like kind of the same point as what was impossible. Everything's prison except for prison, which is sex. Yes. It's worth recalling that what is currently called realistic was itself once impossible. The slew of privatizations that took place since the 1980s would have been unthinkable only a decade earlier. In the current political economic landscape, with unions in abeyance, utilities and railways denationalized, could scarcely have been imagined in 1975. Conversely, what was once eminently possible is now deemed unrealistic. Modernization, Badiou bitterly observes, is the name for a strict and servile definition of the possible. These reforms invariably aim at making impossible what used to be practicable for the largest number, and making profitable for the dominant oligarchy what did not used to be so. It's fairly straightforward, if a bit pretentiously phrased. At this point, it's perhaps worth introducing an elementary theoretical distinction from Lacanian psychoanalysis, which Zizek has done so much to give contemporary currency: the difference between the real and reality. This is very annoying. This is a division of Lacan's idea of the three orders of human experience. Orders, registers. There's a few different names for them, but they are the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. And the symbolic and the imaginary align together in what Lacan unhelpfully calls reality, as opposed to le réel, the real. And so there's this opposition between the real and reality. Reality consisting of the two things that aren't the real, i.e. the symbolic and the imaginary. I'll explain those things as they come up, if they come up, but that's just setting the scene for this. As Alenka Zupancic explains, psychoanalysis' positing of a reality principle invites us to be suspicious of any reality that presents itself as natural. So the reality principle is a Freudian idea. It's a development of the pleasure principle, which is his initial hypothesis for the fundamental like driving force of people, which is also called eros, or the libido, the pleasure principle. Lustprinzips in German. It's a great word. But the reality principle develops after the pleasure principle, and it says, I can delay gratification now for some other gratification later. So the marshmallow test is the sort of shorthand for the reality principle. But it also is like, I can go to work for 20 years and then I'll be able to buy a house. You know, same basic thing, the reality principle. The reality principle, Zupancic writes, is not some kind of natural way associated with how things are. It's just, sorry, this is unimportant, but you notice that Mark Fisher spells Zizek with the Z with the little chupchik, but Zupancic, which also has chupchiks on the C's, does not get them. Okay, here we go. The reality principle, Zupancic writes, is not some kind of natural way associated with how things are. The reality principle itself is ideologically mediated. One could even claim that it constitutes the highest form of ideology. Sorry, I should be saying ideology, maybe. Whatever. The ideology that presents itself as empirical fact, or biological economic necessity, and that we tend to perceive as non-ideological. It's precisely here that we should be most alert to the functioning of ideology. So this is the classic Zizekian idea of ideology, which is the thing that is ignored and claimed to be not political and like just is just the case, or something like that. And this kind of makes sense to me because I use that kind of argument with my psych all the time. I'm like, well, that's just true. Normally about very negative predictions about the future or something. Anyway, maybe it is precisely there that I should be most alert to the functioning of ideology. On a personal level, which, yeah, anyway. For Lacan, the real is what any reality must suppress. Indeed, reality constitutes itself through just this repression. So this is getting very technical and like kind of on the outskirts of my ability to understand Lacanian analysis. But let's just push on through and hope it becomes more clear. The real is an unrepresentable X, a traumatic void that can only be glimpsed in the fractures and inconsistencies in the field of apparent reality. So one strategy against capitalist realism could involve invoking the reals underlying the reality that capitalism presents to us. Okay, so I suspect this is going to be moderately incomprehensible for at least some people watching this, and it's, as I say, kind of on the edge of my ability to understand this kind of thing. The real is defined as that which resists symbolization entirely, which kind of, by definition, makes it impossible to talk about, which is very convenient for philosophers trying to sound smart. But I think he's going to talk about them. But one common example is a natural disaster, which is kind of confusing because it is real in the kind of colloquial sense of like it's just a brute fact of the natural physical world that we live in, that or something like that, and we can't like argue with it. I think it's that you can't argue with it part that is relevant. It's like it doesn't respond to language or ideas. Yeah, but also the real is kind of like these problems that language creates. Like, whatever. Okay, this is getting too deep. Let's just push on and hopefully it'll become more clear. But let me know if you have thoughts or questions or things that might clarify this for you. Environmental catastrophe is one such real. At one level, to be sure, it might look as if green issues are very far from being unrepresentable voids for capitalist culture. Climate change and the threat of resource depletion are not being repressed so much as incorporated into advertising and marketing. What this treatment of environmental catastrophe illustrates is the fantasy structure on which capitalist realism depends. A presupposition that resources are infinite, that the earth itself is merely a husk which capital can, at a certain point, slough off like a used skin, and that any problem can be solved by the market. Nice. I have no idea about Ulrich Beck, but let me know what comes up. This is again a kind of like basic, like entry-level progressive thing. Like you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. But I guess Marx was writing 15 years ago, something like that, when neoliberalism was in, its full bloom. In the end, Wally represents a version of this fantasy, the idea that the infinite expansion of capital is possible, that capital can proliferate without labor. On the off-world ship, Axiom, all labor is performed by robots, that the burning up of Earth's resources is only a temporary glitch, and that after a suitable period of recovery, capital can terraform the planet and recolonize it. I should watch Wally again. Yet environmental catastrophe features in late capitalist culture only as a kind of simulacra, its real implications for capitalism too traumatic to be assimilated into the system. The significance of green critiques is that they suggest that, far from being the only viable political economic system, capitalism is in fact primed to destroy the entire human environment. The relationship between capitalism and eco-disaster is neither coincidental nor accidental. Capital's need of a constantly expanding market, its growth fetish, which is the title of a pretty good book by Clive Hamilton, who is now sort of like a professional anti-Chinese activist, but growth fetish was pretty good. Mean that capitalism is by its very nature opposed to any notion of sustainability. But green issues are already a contested zone, already a site where politicization is being fought for. In what follows, I want to stress two other aporias, little gaps, in capitalist realism, which are not yet politicized to anything like the same degree. The first is mental health. Mental health, in fact, is a paradigm. Maybe this is the chapter where he talks about mental illness and bureaucracy. Spoilers. I forget what number 2 is about. Chapter 2. I said at the start that it was giving his suggestions of what to organize around. But maybe it was just like, we have to have hope. It does, in fact, rely on us participating in this ideological kind of way. And now, chapter 3 is his, like, what are the weak points in capitalism? The first is mental health. Mental health, in fact, is a paradigm case of how capitalist realism operates. Capitalist realism insists on treating mental health as if it were a natural fact, like weather. But then again, weather is no longer a natural fact so much as a political economic effect. In the 1960s and 70s, radical theory and politics, Lang, Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, etc., coalesced around extreme mental conditions such as schizophrenia. arguing, for example, that madness was not a natural but a political category. But what is needed now is a politicization of much more common disorders. Indeed, it's their very commonness which is the issue. In Britain, depression is now the condition that is most treated by the NHS. In his book The Selfish Capitalist, Oliver James has convincingly posited a correlation between rising rates of mental distress and the neoliberal mode of capitalism practiced in countries like Britain, the USA, and Australia. In line with James's claims, I want to argue that it's necessary to reframe the growing problem of stress and distress in capitalist societies. Instead of treating it as incumbent on individuals to resolve their own psychological distress, indeed, that is, of accepting the vast privatization of stress that has taken place over the last 30 years, and so much more since 2009 when this was written, we need to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many, I'm just thinking of smartphones becoming omnipresent, so people take their work home with them without even thinking about it. My personal pet peeve around talking about mental health is when people use the term mental health and mental ill health interchangeably. Are you talking about the bad brain bits or not, chumps? Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's yes, mental illness versus mental health. I don't know. It's an interesting. People be like, "Oh, do you have mental health?" Meaning, do you have mental ill health? It's very funny. It's like, I could care less. Or I couldn't care less, Okay. How has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill? And so much more since the pandemic. The mental health plague in capitalist societies would suggest that, instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional, and the cost of it appearing to work is very high. Okay, my counterpoint to this is, how unwell were, peasants in 1100? I would guess fairly. I reckon a lot of them were probably really mentally ill, not knowing anything about them other than they lived in horrible poverty. The other phenomenon I want to highlight is bureaucracy. In making their case against socialism, neoliberal ideologues, see, this is interesting. This is the issue about ideology versus ideology, because ideology has this colloquial meaning about, a political stance or a worldview or something, as opposed to the ideology that Zizek talks about. And I just distinguish between them with that ideology thing, but there's no difference between the words, and it's hard to tell which people mean sometimes. But in this case, I think it means ideologues, people with a view. Yeah, that's fair, but I reckon the Black Plague probably made a lot of people pretty unhappy, would be my guess. Neoliberal ideologues often excoriated the top-down bureaucracy which supposedly led to institutional sclerosis and inefficiency in command economies. With the triumph of neoliberalism, bureaucracy was supposed to have been made obsolete, a relic of an unlamented Stalinist past. Yeah, and feast days and shit. Yet this is at odds with the experiences of most people working and living in late capitalism. But to be fair, even someone quite poor like me owns more timekeeping devices than an entire city would have a few hundred years ago. So, swings and roundabouts. This is at odds with the experience of most people working and living in late capitalism, for whom bureaucracy remains very much a part of everyday life, yeah. Instead of disappearing, bureaucracy has changed its form, and this new decentralized form has allowed it to proliferate. The persistence of bureaucracy in late capitalism does not in itself indicate that capitalism doesn't work. Rather, what it suggests is the way in which capitalism does actually work is very different from the picture presented by capitalist realism. I think that's a nice way of putting that. Sorry, I think I'm scrolling too far past. I think that's a nice way of putting that. He's not being the fact that there's bureaucracy isn't a problem, but it operates differently than how they say, so it might be a weak point that we could, agitate around, something like that. In part, I've chosen to focus on mental health problems and bureaucracy because they both feature heavily in an area of culture which has become increasingly dominated by the imperatives of capitalist realism: education. Through most of the current decade, I worked as a lecturer in a further education college, and in what follows, I'll draw extensively on my experiences there. Okay, so this next section is basically Mark being what have phones but too much? I am a boomer, and kids these days don't even know. And it's a little bit cringe, but I also think he's got a few okay points in here as well. So let's try and be generous and critical. Generous with one hand and critical with the other. In Britain, further education colleges used to be places which students, often from working class backgrounds, were drawn to if they wanted an alternative to more formal state educational institutions. Yep, that's literally the thing. Yeah. So this is like a TAFE, I guess? Ever since further education colleges were removed from local authority control in the early 1990s, they've become subject both to market pressures and to government-imposed targets. They've been at the vanguard of changes that would be rolled out through the rest of the education system and public services. A kind of lab in which neoliberal reforms of education have been trialled, and as such, they're the perfect place to begin an analysis of the effects of capitalist realism. Oh, this must be the bit. It must be chapter 4, where he's talking about kids these days. Let's push on. We're going about half an hour. I reckon it'll be about another half hour for this chapter, so let's rock and roll. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Reflexive Impotence, Immobilization, and Liberal Communism. In contrast with their forebears in the 1960s and 1970s, British students today appear to be politically disengaged. While French students can still be found on the streets protesting against neoliberalism, as true today as it was then, British students, whose situation is incomparably worse, seem resigned to their fate. But this, I want to argue, is a matter not of apathy nor of cynicism, but of reflexive impotence. They know things are bad, but more than that, they know that they can't do anything about it. Amen. But that knowledge, that reflexivity, is not a passive observation of an already existing state of affairs. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other thing is, yeah, totally. Yeah, you'll love... I mean, that's kind of what I was going to say, is that, like, he killed himself a few years after writing this, and I think a lot of this book makes a lot of sense as a kind of, if not suicide note, I mean, definitely a suicide note, but also, like, an argument with himself about whether or not his depression is true, and he's trying to convince himself that it's not. And it's a reflexive impotence. The knowledge is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And he's going to complain about kids about it, but I think he's worried about it in himself. Maybe I'm reading that into it, but I doubt it. Reflexive impotence amounts to an unstated worldview amongst the British young, and it has its correlate in widespread pathologies. Yeah. Many of the teenagers I worked with had mental health problems or learning difficulties. Depression is endemic. It's the condition most dealt with by the NHS and is afflicting people at increasingly younger ages. The number of students who have some variant of dyslexia is astonishing. It's not an exaggeration to say that being a teenager in late capitalist Britain is now close to being reclassified as a sickness. Amen. This pathologization already forecloses any possibility of politicization. Foreclosure, it's a technical psychoanalytic term, doesn't really matter. Yeah, it's a psychotic negation as opposed to a neurotic negation, which is repression. So to repress the possibility of politicization would be like, well, I could go to this protest, but I don't want to, and my ex is going to be there, and I hate the speaker, and I have to do something else, so I guess I won't. Whereas this is like, well, possibility, like, I could never be political. That's not a plausible option for me. So, no, different type of negation. But I don't think that's super important right here, but, you know, nerd time. By privatizing these problems, treating them as if they were caused only by chemical imbalances in the individual's neurology, or by chemical imbalances in the individual... By privatizing these problems, treating them as if they were caused only by chemical imbalances in the individual's neurology and or by their family background, any question of social systemic causation is ruled out. Yeah, I'd say that's largely accurate of my experience, though I'd say, you know, I was seeing doctors about depression in 2009, and it was a lot of this, and I see them about it now, and a lot of them are like, yeah, well, look, it's the world we live in, isn't it? Huh? But, you know, can't do anything about that, so here, try these meds. So, I don't know, I feel like this has... The like, ideological cover for this has changed, even though the sort of practical arrangement is the same, right? It's still functionally privatized. It's just that the doctors are like sympathetic about it instead of not. I mean, not that they weren't sympathetic before, but you know what I mean. Many of the teenage students I encountered seemed to be in a state of what I would call depressive hedonia. Here's another banger, 30 whacks to take to your therapy sessions. Depression is usually characterized as a state of anhedonia, but the condition I'm referring to is constituted not by an inability to get pleasure so much as by an inability to do anything else except pursue pleasure. There's a sense that something is missing, but no appreciation that this mysterious missing enjoyment can only be accessed beyond the pleasure principle. Sorry about my weird intonation, it's from listening to all this Talmud stuff. Weird coming out of this as a gender studies person, which is all about the personal is political. Yeah, totally. It's an interesting point. Okay, so this Beyond the Pleasure Principle is the title of a famous book by Freud, where he says there's this thing other than the pleasure principle. It's called the drive, and the drive produces enjoyment. This is the Lacanian read on Freud's theory of the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the death drive. I assume there are other reads of it that I'm not familiar with, but this sense that something is missing, that's the logic of desire. Like, oh, I'll get something and it'll fill up this hole inside my being, but actually that enjoyment is only available beyond the pleasure principle in the logic of drive, which doesn't have an object in the same way. In large part, this is a consequence of students' ambiguous structural position, stranded between their old role as subjects of disciplinary institutions and their new status as consumers of services, right? The difference between going to a high school and going to a uni. In his crucial essays Postscript on Societies of Control, Deleuze distinguishes between the disciplinary societies described by Foucault, which were organized around the enclosed spaces of the factory, the school, and the prison, and the new control societies in which all institutions are embedded in a dispersed corporation. Didn't bring my phone outside, so just write my search phrases here later. Yeah. Yep. All the institutions are embedded in a dispersed corporation. I'm not entirely sure what that means in this particular context. I haven't read Postscripts on Societies of Control because Deleuze is impossible. Deleuze is right to argue that Kafka is the prophet of the distributed cybernetic power that is typical of control societies. In The Trial, Kafka importantly distinguishes between two types of acquittal available to the accused. Definite acquittal is no longer possible if it ever was. We have only legendary accounts of ancient cases which provide instances of acquittal. I assume that's a quote from The Trial. I've only read a little bit of it like a decade and a half ago more. The two remaining options, then, are 1. Ostensible acquittal, in which the accused is to all intents and purposes acquitted, but may later at some unspecified time face the charges in full. Or 2. Indefinite postponement, in which the accused engages in what they hope is an infinitely protracted process of legal wrangling, so that the dreaded ultimate judgment is unlikely to be forthcoming. Terrifying. Deleuze observes that the control societies delineated by Kafka himself, but also by Foucault and Burroughs, operate using indefinite postponement. Education is a lifelong process, training that persists for as long as your working life continues. Work you take home with you, working from home, homing from work. That's definitely written in a pre-pandemic era when working from home became a symbol of like some kind of hope for a radical future where work is like organized around the worker in some way, but I can see the negative side of it as well, and there were definitely like think pieces about that aspect of it, but yeah, anyway. A consequence of this indefinite mode of power is that external surveillance is succeeded by internal policing. Control only works if you're complicit with it. Hence the Burroughs figure of the control addict, the one who's addicted to control, but also who's addicted to control, but also inevitably the one who's been taken over, possessed by control. Sorry, one sec. Okay, sorry. Alright. The one who's addicted to control, but also inevitably the one who's been taken over, possessed by control. So for this, I always think about like cops, how they like, sell their soul to become a police officer, and then they, people who aren't cops don't want to hang out with them as much, or like everywhere they go, they see people doing crimes and like feel an obligation to like intervene, or like how, Donald Trump wanted to win the election, but he didn't want to be president because the president has to like go to meetings and read briefings and make difficult decisions and stuff. They get possessed by control. Yeah. Walk into almost any class at the college where I taught, and you'll immediately appreciate that you're in a post-disciplinary framework. Foucault painstakingly enumerated the way in which discipline was installed through the imposition of rigid body postures. During lessons at our college, however, students will be found slumped on the desk, talking almost constantly, snacking incessantly, or even on occasions eating full meals. The old disciplinary segmentation of time is breaking down. The carceral regime of discipline is being eroded by the technologies of control, with their systems of perpetual consumption and continuous development. Doesn't sound that bad to me, TBH, but that's fine. The system by which the college is funded, like, oh no, the kids are eating. Yeah, that's right. The system by which the college is funded means that it literally cannot afford to exclude students, even if it wanted to. Resources are allocated to colleges on the basis of how successfully they meet targets on achievements, exam results, attendance and retention of students. This combination of market imperatives with bureaucratically defined targets is typical of the market-Stalinist initiatives which now regulate public services. The lack of an effective disciplinary system has not, to say the least, been compensated for by an increase in student self-motivation. Students are aware that if they don't attend for weeks on end, and or if they don't produce any work, they'll not face meaningful sanction. Again, cool. Seems alright. They just let people go to uni if they feel like it, bro. They typically respond to this freedom not by pursuing projects, but by falling into hedonic or anhedonic lassitudes. The soft narcosis, the comfort food oblivion of PlayStation, all-night TV, and marijuana. No, well, so I think he doesn't like that term. It's a thing. Nope. He made it up. There you go. Well, we may or may not get to an explanation of it. Ask students to read for more than a couple of sentences, and many, and these A-level students, mind you, will protest that they can't do it. It may. No, here I am, making myself do it. And thank you for coming along with me as I force myself to do so. That's why I make memes of Slavoj Žižek, just to make myself read a couple of sentences. It's not so much the content of the written material that's at issue here, it's the act of reading itself that's deemed to be boring. What we're facing here is not just time-honored teenage torpor, that's a good return of phrase despite my resentment, but the mismatch between a post-literate new flesh that is too wired to concentrate and the confining concentrational logics of decaying disciplinary systems. To be bored simply means to be removed from the communicative sensation-stimulus matrix of texting, YouTube, and fast food. To be denied for a moment the constant flow of sugary gratification on demand. I mean, I don't disagree with this, really. Like, I do feel pretty addicted to social media. Like, he's kind of not wrong. But anyway, that's fine. Some students want Nietzsche in the same way that they want a hamburger. They fail to grasp, and the logic of the consumer system encourages this misapprehension, that the indigestibility, the difficulty, is Nietzsche. Okay, so, again, this is him very indirectly trying to explain the logic of drive. So the logic of desire is, like, give me the takeaway. Like, literally, like, not, and it's kind of a pun about hamburgers, but also, like, the cliff notes, the takeaway message of Nietzsche. And, like, there's a bunch of takeaway messages from Nietzsche that you could take, not that I know them, I don't really know Nietzsche, but, there's a bunch of, like, little takeaway points that you can just give someone about any thinker, pretty much. And sure, that isn't going to change their life, probably, unless they engage with it on a deeper level. But, like, I think that's possible. But that's not going to, like, sate that hole in them. The thing that will actually be rewarding is, like, grinding your way through this impossible text, page by page, and being like, what is this about? That's what I'm doing right now, I think. We're trying. But I think Mark is getting too caught up in his, like, resentment of this changing, like, milieu to properly make a point. Also, I would argue that the hamburger is a great example of another indigestible thing, like kind of metaphorically in a, like, again, it's kind of a boomer take, but like, people are always like, oh, eat Chipotle, get the shits or whatever. I don't know. They talk about that in The Good Place, which I've been watching recently, that like such and such a fast food place gives you diarrhea or whatever. And like, you could totally argue that that's the thing that the drive is invested in, is like the diarrhea that comes with the burger or something. So I think Mark has kind of inadvertently picked a bad example, because he's arguing that they should want the diarrhea of Nietzsche, as it were. Anyway, an illustration. This is some boomer shit. I challenged one student about why he always wore headphones in class. He replied that it didn't matter. He wasn't actually playing any music. In another lesson, he was playing music at a very low volume through the headphones without wearing them. When I asked him to switch it off, he replied that even he couldn't hear it. Okay, so here I have a question. How does Mark know that it's playing music if he can't hear it? Anyway, why wear the headphones without playing music, or play music without wearing the headphones? Because the presence of the phones on the ears and the knowledge that the music is playing, even if he couldn't hear it, was a reassurance that the matrix was still there within reach. Besides, in a classic example of interpassivity, if the music was still playing, even if he couldn't hear it, then the player could still enjoy it on his behalf. The use of headphones is significant here. Pop is experienced not as something which could have impacts upon public space, but as a retreat into private iPod consumer bliss, a walling up against the social. Yeah. Sounds like this guy's just a bit of a weirdo. I don't know. Hey, what up? Yeah, what up, Connor Jonathan? Thank you for coming along. I am reading Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. This is my Philosophy Fridays, start at 10:30 Melbourne time. Yeah, totally, 30 wax. It is a really cool piece of contemporary political philosophy from 2009 by a guy called Mark Fisher. I'm recording this and putting it on YouTube, and then at the end of this chapter, I'm going to switch over to playing Europa Universalis 4, which you're very welcome to stick around for as well. This chapter, yeah, totally, and he was big in the meme philosophy scene a few years ago. It's kind of died down a bit now, but yeah, that's right. And one of the like interesting things about this book, I've said this a few times, so apologies for people who've already heard this, but like it's A, kind of a suicide note, and B, kind of an argument with himself. He's like being like, people are depressed, and that makes them not want to do, stuff that might make the world a better place. But it's clearly him being like, I don't think I can make the world a better place, but I think I might be able to argue myself into believing that I can. At least that's my read on it. But anyway, this thing about interpassivity, there was a really good tweet that I saw about ChatGPT cheats, which was a Zizek quote, but it was fake. But I legitimately thought it was a real quote from him that was like, ideally, the students would get ChatGPT to write all of their essays, and then the teachers would get ChatGPT to mark all of the essays. Neither of them have to worry about that anymore, and then everyone can actually go to class and learn things, and the assignments will take care of it themselves. Anyway. I also don't think that this is a good example, an illustration of people who want hamburger Nietzsche. I don't think that is a good example of that. It's not really got anything to do with it as far as I can see. But maybe you can see something I can't there. The consequence of being hooked into the entertainment matrix is twitchy, agitated interpassivity, an inability to concentrate or focus. Students' incapacity to connect current lack of focus with future failure. That's another fun sentence. Students' incapacity to connect current lack of focus with future failure, their inability to synthesize time into any coherent narrative, is symptomatic of more than mere demotivation. It is in fact eerily reminiscent of Jameson's analysis in postmodernism and consumer society. Jameson observed there that Lacan's theory of schizophrenia offered a suggestive aesthetic model for understanding the fragmenting of subjectivity in the face of emerging entertainment industrial complex. Wow, that's a long, twisty paragraph. But I think basically he's saying Netflix be making people crazy. With the breakdown of the signifying chain, Jameson summarized, the Lacanian schizophrenic is reduced to an experience of pure material signifiers, or in other words, a series of pure and unrelated presents in time. So I think this issue about the Lacanian schizophrenic, we're not necessarily talking about someone who would be diagnosed with schizophrenia by the modern DSM. It's kind of more like calling someone a Virgo or something like that, or like an. Thank you very much for the follow. I appreciate that. What's your? Are you interested in philosophy? How did you arrive here? Thank you very much for coming. But yeah, let me know what your interest is. Or like a Myers-Briggs indicator thing. The MBTI. Sorry, no, that's just the name of the test. The what is it? INFJ is reduced to an experience of pure material signifiers. Basically, the Lacanian schizophrenic doesn't appreciate the way in which language is kind of detached from reality, like detached from the material world or something like that. And so words kind of have an almost material presence. And so that's why, and again, I'm not necessarily talking about someone who would be diagnosed with schizophrenia today, but we have this idea of schizophrenics like hearing voices or whatever, but the voices appear to them to be real. That's because words have a kind of weight for this group of people that they don't for neurotics or whatever. That's right. For them, it does. I'm a politics and international relations student in England and France. Very cool. And congratulations for next year. Hope that goes well. Interested in political philosophy. Not the most knowledgeable. European security studies. Very interesting. I don't know very much about that, but cool. Okay, Jameson was writing the late 1980s, i.e. the period in which most of my students were born. What we in the classroom are now facing is a generation born into that ahistorical, anti-mnemonic blip culture. A generation, that is to say, for whom time has always come ready cut into digital micro-slices. I don't really know what he means here. This just seems like more boomer shit to me, being like, kids these days are on their phones. I have a lot of sympathy and appreciation for Mark Fisher, but I think a lot of this stuff is not making the points that he thinks it is. And instead is just kind of grumpy, but that's fine. He's allowed to be grumpy. If the figure of discipline was the worker prisoner, the figure of control is the debtor addict. So he's comparing the societies of discipline and the society of control, and the like main subject, both in the sense of like, a subject of a king or whatever, like the subject of the disciplinary regime, but also subject in a kind of philosophical sense of like a person who goes around experiencing the world in a particular way. Was the worker prisoner, so, a proletarian, for example. The figure of control is the debtor addict. And again, he's thinking about neoliberalism here. He's writing in 2009. Cyberspatial... Oh, okay. No worries. Peace out. Thanks for coming along. Or unless you mean... Yes, metaphorically. In rage. Cyberspatial capital operates by addicting its users. Call me out further, why don't you, Mark? William Gibson recognized that in Neuromancer, which when he had Case and the other cyberspace cowboys feeling insects under the skin strung out when they unplugged from the Matrix. Case's amphetamine habit is plainly the substitute for an addiction to a far more abstract speed. That's a cool sentence, even though, it's also kind of grumpy. If, then, something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a pathology, it's a pathology of late capitalism, a consequence of being wired into the entertainment control circuits of hyper-mediated consumer culture. Now, this is interesting. I know a lot of people really object to this. I actually read this last week, but the recording didn't go right, so that's why I haven't uploaded it, whatever. And someone who was here, who I have a lot of respect for and who knows a lot about this kind of thing, said that this was like a pretty shitty take and that it's kind of a biological issue. I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychiatrist or anything like that, but I think I read an interesting tweet thread or article or something ages ago about how we're very willing to admit that depression and anxiety are conditions, neurological conditions that might have like physiological instantiations from not enough serotonin or whatever other kind of thing, that like your brain chemistry is bad or whatever, not normal. neurodivergent in whatever way, we're like, that's fine. Like, that can come from trauma or from neglect or from, like, living in late capitalism or whatever. And, like, we do this with a lot of mental illnesses, eating disorders, all sorts of stuff. But for ADHD, that's kind of a taboo theory or something. People just want to say, like, no, it's just, that's it, that's how I was born. And, like, maybe, like, I legitimately do not know what the etiology of ADHD is, and I'm not trying to make a claim about that. I just think that it's not obvious that it's not at least exacerbated by some kind of cultural or social process. Yep, 100%. Yeah. Why are all these hyperactive people taking amphetamines and then getting strung out when we take away both their amphetamines and other coping mechanisms? That's so weird. Similarly, what is called dyslexia may in many cases amount to a postlexia. Kids be using emojis, am I right? Teenagers process Capital's image-dense data very efficiently without any need to read. Slogan recognition is sufficient to navigate the net mobile magazine informational plane. Writing has never been capitalism's thing. Capitalism is profoundly illiterate, Deleuze and Guattari argued in Anti-Oedipus. Electric language does not go by way of the voice or writing. Data processing does without them both. Interesting. Hence the reason that many successful business people are dyslexic. Really? Is that true, or is that the reason? But is their post-lexical efficiency a cause or effect of their success? Hi, Mr. Dog. How are you going? Do you want to hop up and help me read a page? Up you pop, mister. Come on. Come on. Up you pop. Come say hi to everybody. Yep. Come on. Good boy. Well, let's scoop you up. Who's a good boy? Teachers are now put under intolerable pressure to mediate between the post-literate subjectivity of the late capitalist consumer, and the demands of the disciplinary regime to pass examinations and so on. This is one way in which education, far from being in some ivory tower safely inured from the real world, is the engine room of the reproduction of social reality, directly confronting the inconsistencies of the capitalist social field. I don't quite follow that. It's one way in which education is the engine room of the reproduction of social reality. Sure, directly confronting the inconsistencies of capitalist social field. Right, so this post-lexia thing is interesting. I think it's an interesting point. Several other things. They weren't teaching kids to read properly. Yep. Totally. Yeah. I feel like there could be a whole lot of other sort of explanations for why that was the case at the time. Yep. I guess this is kind of him being like, teachers are constantly having to, like, explain away the gaps in capitalist realism. Like, well, you need to learn this to go out and get a real job, and then, like, 80% of graduates are unemployed or whatever, they're constantly facing those inconsistencies. Teachers are caught between being facilitated entertainers and disciplinarian authoritarians. Yeah, he's a good little boy. It's alright, it'll be on YouTube to re-listen if you want. Teachers want to help students to pass the exams. They want us to be authority figures who tell them what to do. Teachers being interpolated by students as authority figures exacerbates the boredom problem. Since isn't anything that comes from the place of authority a priori boring? No, people love good teachers, dude. Ironically, the role of the disciplinarian is demanded of educators more than ever, precisely the time when disciplinary structures are breaking down in institutions. That makes sense to me, just like it becomes a devolved responsibility when it's no longer the, like, primary mechanism, but when it's still, like, needed, we outsource it. Just kind of, I don't know, it's the same as, like, garbage collection. Like, we deeply rely on it as a society, but it's considered, like, a bad job. I'm sure it's a horrible job a lot of the time, but, like, surely it should be, like, I don't know. I fucking love garbage collectors, basically. That's all. The backbone of our society, and deeply under-acknowledged. When families buckling under the pressure of a capitalism which requires both parents to work, teachers are now increasingly required to act as surrogate parents, instilling the most basic behavioral protocols in students and providing pastoral and emotional support for teenagers who are in some cases only minimally socialized. It's worth stressing that none of the students I taught had any legal obligation to be at college. They could leave if they wanted to. But the lack of any meaningful employment opportunities, together with cynical encouragement from government, means that college seems to be the safer, easier option. Deleuze says that control societies are based on debt rather than enclosure, but there's a way in which the current education system both indebts and encloses students. Pay for your own exploitation, the logic insists. Get into debt so you can get the same job you could have walked into if you'd left school at 16. Hi, at me. Jameson observed that the breakdown of temporality suddenly releases the present of time from all the activities and intentionalities that might focus it and make it a space of praxis. Okay. ADHD makes it hard to be an activist, I think, is what is going on there. But nostalgia for the context in which the old type of praxis operated is plainly useless. Right, we can't go back to the good old days when union membership was strong and whatever. That's why French students don't in the end constitute an alternative to the British reflexive impotence. That the neoliberal economist would deride French opposition to capitalism is hardly surprising, yet its mockery of French immobilization has a point. Certainly the students who kicked off the latest protests seem to think they were reenacting the events of May 1968. Their parents sprang on Charles de Gaulle, it wrote in its lead article of March 30, 1960. Sorry. March 30, 2006, sorry. They've borrowed its slogans, beneath the cobblestones, the beach, and hijacked its symbols, the Sorbonne University. In this sense, the revolt seems to be the natural sequel to 2005's suburban riots, which prompted the government to impose a state of emergency. Then it was the jobless ethnic underclass that rebelled against a system that excluded them. Yet the striking feature of the latest protest movement is that this time the rebellious forces are on the side of conservatism. Unlike the rioting youths in the banlieues, the objectives of the students and public sector trade unions is to prevent change and to keep France the way it is. Okay, I don't actually know what the French protests he's talking about were about, but yeah. It's striking how the practice of many of the immobilizers is a kind of inversion of that of another group who also count themselves heirs of 68, the so-called liberal communists such as George Soros and Bill Gates, who combine the rapacious pursuit of profit along with the rhetoric of ecological concern and social responsibility. Alongside their social concern, liberal communists believe that work practice should be postmodernized, in line with the concept of being smart. As Zizek explains, Mein Gott, being smart means being dynamic and nomadic and against centralized bureaucracy. Believing in dialogue and cooperation as against central authority, in flexibility as against routine, culture and knowledge as against industrial production. It's a great question. In spontaneous interaction and autopoiesis as against fixed hierarchy. Thanks. Cleared that way up, Slavoj. Taken together, the immobilizers with their implicit concession that capitalism can only be resisted, never overcome, and the liberal communists who maintain that the amoral excesses of capitalism must be offset by charity, give a sense of the way in which capitalist realism circumscribes current political possibilities. Whereas the immobilizers retain the form of 68-style protest, but in the name of resistance to change, liberal communists energetically embrace newness. So I think he's positing these as kind of like the two outside edges of acceptable resistance. One where you're making conservative demands but in a radical way, and the other one where you're making actually progressive demands but in a like reactionary way that doesn't move in that direction really. Zizek is right to argue that, far from constituting any kind of progressive corrective to official capitalist ideology, liberal communism constitutes the dominant ideology of capitalism now. I think this might also be ideology of capitalism, kind of both, in this case. Flexibility, again, I don't know if that's a distinction anyone other than me makes, so don't, well, do take it out of here. Just pretend it's a thing. Flexibility, nomadism, and spontaneity are the very hallmarks of management in a post-Fordist control society. Yeah. But I don't know what the demands were that he's talking about. But the problem is that any opposition to flexibility and decentralization risks being self-defeating, since calls for inflexibility and centralization are, to say the least, not likely to be very galvanizing. In any case, resistance to the new is not a cause that the left can or should rally around. Capital thought very carefully about how to break labor, yet there's still not been enough thought about what tactics will work against capital in conditions of post-Fordism, and what new language can be innovated to deal with those conditions. It's important to contest capitalism's appropriation of the new, but to reclaim the new can't be a matter of adapting to the conditions in which we find ourselves. We've done that rather too well, and successful adaptation is the strategy of managerialism par excellence. The persistent association of neoliberalism... yeah, I guess he's just saying, like, we can't just come up with something new because capital is really good at dealing with something new. Okay, so what are you suggesting then, Mark? The persistent association of neoliberalism with the term restoration, favoured by both Badiou and David Harvey, is an important... rest in peace, I think, right? He just died recently. Is an important corrective to the association of capital with novelty. For Harvey and Badiou, neoliberal politics are not about the new, but a return of class power and privilege. In France, Badiou has said, restoration refers to the period of the return of the king. In 1815, after the Revolution and Napoleon, we are in such a period. Today we see liberal capitalism and its political system, parliamentarism, as the only natural and acceptable solutions. I actually think this is really true. Even in like progressive and leftist spaces, people get really edgy when anyone suggests parliamentarism is like not actually a neutral way of dealing with, I don't know, issues in general. Hi, Mister. Who's a sweet boy? Yeah, hello. Oh, it is? Okay, who am I thinking of? David, who wrote, Debt? Oh, Graeber. Was his name David? Sorry about that scare, everybody. Yes. Harvey argues that neoliberalization is best conceived as a political project to re-establish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. Checks out. But again, I feel like we're like largely through the storm of neoliberalism now. This was in 2009 when this was an amazing like prediction of the Abbott government. I think I was reading this originally when Abbott was in power, and like this was all like, yep. And it's not that there's no neoliberalism now, but I think the pandemic did kind of like set back the cause of neoliberalism significantly, and I don't think it's now by default. That's right, yeah, that's kind of what I was about to say. Is like, I don't think it's not the default, but there's not really anything else instead. Like, it's not like Keynesianism or whatever has had a resurgence, or MMT or anything. Anyway, Harvey demonstrates that in an era popularly described as post-political, class war has continued to be fought, but only by one side, the wealthy. Yeah, devastating. After the implementation of neoliberal policies in the late 1970s, Harvey reveals, the share of national income of the top 1% of income earners soared to reach 15% by the end of the century. The top 0.1% of income earners in the US increased their share of the national income from 2% in 1978 to over 6% by 1999, while the ratio of the median compensation of workers to the salaries of CEOs increased from just over 30 to 1 in 1970 to nearly 500 to 1 by 2000. The US is not alone in this. The top 1% of income earners in Britain have doubled their share of the national income from 6.5% to 13% since 1982. Okay, sure, whatever. Like, the rich are getting richer. It's fine. Yep. This is like, yeah, relatively convincing evidence of that. I'm not sure we needed a whole paragraph of it. As Harvey shows, neoliberal... again, I guess this is... I'm reading this at a time different from when he was writing it, so maybe it was more important then. And like... yeah, I don't know. As Harvey shows, neoliberals were more Leninist than the Leninists, using think tanks as the intellectual vanguard to create the ideological climate in which capitalist realism could flourish. It's a really good book called Inventing the Future by Cernacek and Williams, which maybe I'll read some of it in the future. It was maybe, I think, the first like political philosophy I ever read of my own accord. But it talks about the neoliberal thought collective, think tank network thing at great length. The immobilization model, which amounts to a demand to retain the Fordist disciplinary regime, headbutted in the throat by a dog, could not work in Britain or the other countries in which neoliberalism had already taken a hold. Fordism has definitely collapsed in Britain, and with it the sites around which the old politics were organized. At the end of the control essay, Deleuze wonders what new forms of an anti-control politics might take. We're nearly done here, by the way. Yeah, just this last page. One of the most important questions will concern the ineptitude of the unions, tied to the whole of their history of struggle against the disciplines, or within the spaces of enclosure. Will they be able to adapt themselves, or will they give way to new forms of resistance against the societies of control? Can we already grasp the rough outlines of the coming forms, capable of threatening the joys of marketing? Many young people strangely boast of being motivated. They re-request apprenticeships and permanent training. It's up to them to discover what they're being made to serve, just as their elders discovered, not without difficulty, the telos of their disciplines. Okay, I've no fucking clue what that was about, but somehow I still understood it more than most things by Deleuze that I've ever read. I legitimately don't need... Sick burn. I'm pretty sure Mark Fisher was like very involved in union activism, and Deleuze definitely did a lot of protest work as well. Like, he wasn't like not involved in union activism, but yes, he was an academic. What must be discovered is a way out of... It wasn't like Marx level unionism. What must be discovered is a way out of the motivation-demotivation binary, so that disidentification from the control program registers as something other than dejected apathy. Yeah, I would love that, actually, thanks. One strategy would be to shift the political terrain, to move away from the union's traditional focus on pay and onto forms of discontent specific to post-Fordism. Before we analyse that further, we must consider in more depth what post-Fordism actually is. End of chapter 4. We won't continue with chapter 5 today, but that's called October 6th, 1979. Don't let yourself get attached to anything. No, well, I think that is the dejected apathy that he's talking about. No worry, Connor. Catch you. Thanks you again for coming in. It was lovely to have you here. Oh, here's little Boggle saying goodbye. Yeah, catch you later. Everyone else, I'm going to switch to games in a minute when I've had a bit more of a ramble about this last thing. There's this Jewish idea that I really like. It's a saying from Pirkei Avot, the sayings of our fathers, I'm pretty sure, which is how does it go? Lo alecha hamlecha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lahibatel mamena, velo ata ben chorin. Sorry, whatever. It means it's not on you to complete the work, but nor are you free to desist from it, which I really like. I found that very useful in depths of depression at times, and I like the idea of like, look, you don't have to like be the one that destroys capitalism, but also like don't give up and keep working at it, 'cause you're not free to desist. I also feel like it makes me feel like small acts in line with my values are worth more than they might appear at first glance, because I don't have to always be completely fair, but being fair sometimes is better than not, or something like that. Anyway, something other than the like motivation demotivation binary. And I think again this is kind of connected, though he should tie it in more explicitly in my opinion, with the issue about, which he started the chapter with, about the pleasure principle and the drive, and the enjoyment that is available beyond the pleasure principle. And this motivation demotivation thing is clearly in the logic of desire, of the pleasure principle, where, look, either I can make radical change and like end capitalism, or I can't, so I won't. Something like that, I want to achieve this end. Whereas the logic of drive is something like, let's keep trying. Let's give it another go. There's meaning made when we attempt things, regardless of their outcomes. And I think that is a pretty good antidote to capitalist realism in a lot of ways. Cool. Well, that's going to be the end of chapter 4. I'm going to switch over to Europa Universalis in a sec. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Oh, yeah. Happy tear face. And I'll catch you next Friday for more Philosophy Fridays.